U.S. President Joe Biden's legislative agenda gets a major boost. And is Donald Trump planning a run again in 2024? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The U.S. Senate just passed the Inflation Reduction Act on Sunday, a landmark win for U.S. President Joe Biden, but it was an uphill battle to get all Democratic senators on board. The $430 billion bill will tackle climate change, lower drug costs for Americans, and impose a 15% minimum tax on corporations earning profits of more than $1 billion a year. Meanwhile, former President Donald Trump is teasing another possible presidential bid. Speaking at this year's Conservative Political Action Conference in Dallas, Texas, this is what he had to say.
America's comeback begins this November, and it will continue onward with the unstoppable momentum that we're going to develop on November 2024, because that's the big one.
So what does this mean for the upcoming midterm elections? And will we see a Biden-Trump rematch in 2024? To discuss this and more, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Monterey, California is Spencer Critchley. He is a Democratic Party strategist and author of Patriots of Two Nations. Here in Washington, D.C. is the rest of our panel. Rina Shah is a political analyst and current affairs commentator. Also with us, Bruce Fein is a constitutional lawyer, and Melik Abdul is a Republican strategist. Welcome to all of you. Melik Abdul, let me start with you. Well, we just saw President Trump, former President Trump, address that CPAC conference. He covered a wide range of issues, from the January 6th hearings to his own impeachment to the upcoming midterm elections. And much of that speech was a major rebuke of all of those things. How did you see the address, and do you think it resonates with rank and file Republicans?
Believe it or not, I actually didn't watch it, but I've seen enough coverage of it that it's pretty consistent with what Donald Trump has done since he lost the election in 2020. But I do think that this actually sets the stage for what's to come. There's a big debate about whether or not Ron DeSantis will run against Donald Trump. I personally believe I'm at a much different place now than I was initially, because I didn't think that Donald Trump would have a chance at beating any Democrat president. But I think the underperformance of both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris actually gives Donald Trump a shot. I think that there are things that Donald Trump should focus on that, re-litigating the 2020 election is not an electoral strategy for Donald Trump, but I think being able to capitalize on the things that the Biden administration, many of us feel as if the Biden administration is getting wrong, and with polling numbers suggesting that the American people are not happy with Joe Biden, I do think that Donald Trump has an opening, but Donald Trump actually has to develop a strategy that's just not simply focused on relitigating the 2020 election. He will have to actually chart a path forward, and I think that that's a winning strategy for Donald Trump if he chooses to run, which is seemingly what will happen.
Melik, the people in America, the voters in America, may not be happy with Joe Biden's performance, but do you think that translates into votes for Donald Trump?
It's a big if, and I think that there's a gamble that Donald Trump is taking, that the people in the country, assuming that the people in the country are so dissatisfied with Joe Biden that they will actually flock to Donald Trump. One of the things that Donald Trump gets wrong, and I think it's a blind spot, not just for him, but for those around him, they forget that it doesn't matter, policy is important, and Donald Trump focuses on policy a lot. But if you look at the polling, even when he was in office, many people were satisfied with his policies. What people did not like was Donald Trump's personality. And so I think that Donald Trump needs to understand that, policy aside, you need to like the person for whom you're voting.
Spencer Critchley, Trump in that address also talked about the Democratic Party. He used very brash, aggressive language. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
We have to seize this opportunity to deal with the radical left, socialist lunatics and fascists, and we have to hit them very, very hard. It has to be a crippling defeat, because our country cannot take it.
So, Spencer, what do you make of his address and his use of expressions like radical left, socialist lunatics, and a crippling defeat?
And fascists. So somehow we managed to be communists and fascists at the same time. I think the important thing to recognize here is this is no longer anything like a debate between the left and right of liberalism, the philosophy on which American democracy is based. A progressive liberal and a libertarian conservative have far more in common as people who believe in liberalism than they do with a Donald Trump, who is an ethnic nationalist and a demagogue and who's staging an attack on liberalism. And this is why, and this is hard for liberals of the left in particular to understand because they tend to be so rationalistic. His use of language has nothing to do with anything we traditionally think of as an objective reality. It calls into question the whole concept of objective reality. He uses language as a form of dark poetry or a magical incantation or as a sort of malign religious service is what he's conducting there. He's just conjuring assertions and beliefs that are completely divorced from any requirement to be supported by evidence.
Spencer, what did you make of what Melik Abdul told us about Donald Trump, that he could get votes if he perhaps changes his personality, that his policies are supported by rank and file Republicans and possibly others, but he needs to change the way he expresses them?
Well, I think theoretically that's true, but I think practically it's impossible because Donald Trump gives every sign, and I'm not alone in this, there's untold numbers of psychologists and psychiatrists who share this opinion, is a very severely damaged person. And I actually feel quite a lot of compassion for him. I can only imagine what he must have gone through in his early childhood to emerge as somebody suffering from, by every sign, just the most malignant narcissism and sociopathy. Now, again, we tend to blame people for this and say they're just evil. I think Trump, as I say, is just damaged. I think he's actually incapable of moral behavior because he's stuck at the development level of a severely abused, emotionally abused infant.
Rina, Shah, Donald Trump was not the only one who used that kind of language at the CPAC conference. There were others, people like Senator Ted Cruz and former Trump White House advisor Steve Bannon. And they actually were severely criticized by the former RNC chairman, Michael Steele. He was on the United States cable network MSNBC. And this is what he said. He said, "It is more fascism than farce. It is more concern than conservatism, and it really is about how we as a citizen respond to this, how we push back against it. We are not opponents of each other. We disagree from time to time on big and small issues, but our first inclination as Americans is not to go and beat the crap out of the neighbor just because they have a yard sign that we don't like." So what do you make of where the Republican Party is heading politically right now? I mean, is there still a place for moderates? People who perhaps can reach out to the other side and find common ground?
Well, if you were a fly on the wall at any CPAC gathering within the past few years, you would believe that any elected Republican across the country could legislate morality. And that's my problem with the modern version of the Republican Party, is that as an American citizen, as somebody who's a daughter of immigrants, I know you can't do that. It's a problem when the state tries to do such a thing. Now, taking it a step further, we talk about sort of the system we have here and what it relies on. Our system, our American system, is really reliant on individual responsibility. And in that very same sentiment that Chairman Michael Steele, the former chairman of the RNC, talked about, I think is really lost, unfortunately, in a great deal of Republicans today. They've allowed themselves to be hijacked as a party by its further, most extreme fringe type of element. And I think that is that's really going to be the type of thing that will remain unless they face and suffer massive electoral losses. Now, of course, we saw in Kansas, when you talk about a woman's right to choose and reproductive freedom, we see conservatives today try to come in with their holy book and say it can't be this way. But Kansas was this sort of glimmer of hope that, no, there are people who are Republicans who did not want to see the overturn of Roe v. Wade. I would caution Democrats, of course, to not use that as what would be applicable for across the country. There are so many people who are just right of center who do not want to identify as Democrats. And those independent and voters in swing states are growing. Why? Because they feel as if nobody is serving them, least of all Donald Trump and his former administration.
All right, Rina, the Kansas vote notwithstanding, but have right-wing radicals, the extreme elements that you talk about, the fringe, as you pointed out, have they effectively taken over the Republican Party?
They've taken over because it's actually quite rich of them. They talk about fear and alarmism from the left, but they use it as a central core of their playbook. They rely on misinformation. They use those who are skeptical voters and prey on them and say, you've got to look at this. And they gaslight them. And they tell them, you're looking at this thing, but it's not this thing. It's that thing. So again, these really rogue type of tactics that I've seen the far right employ in recent years is dangerous, because these tactics are sort of here to stay, because our elected officials, not just candidates who are running for office, are engaging in them. You've got sitting U.S. senators who give rise to this extremism, and that's dangerous for our democracy on the whole.
Bruce Fein, Trump also laid out some policies for the Republican Party during that address, and he talked about issues like immigration, education, and cultural issues as well. And just looking at some examples here, he would like to see the Department of Education dismantled if it does not act on his policies. He wants to increase deportations of illegal immigrants and take a firmer stand on transgender people. He also wants executions for drug dealers. I mean, how did you see this address, and what does it mean politically, not just for Republicans, but for the country?
First of all, instead of speaking at CPAC, he should have volunteered himself for the January 6th committee, investigating the efforts that he undertook to prevent a peaceful transfer of presidential power. He's complained it's a witch hunt. He should be there. He can volunteer. I was in the Justice Department when then President Gerald Ford volunteered. He testified before the House Judiciary Committee when there were concerns raised about his pardon of President Nixon, whether there was any quid pro quo. Why isn't President Trump, former president, there to testify? He says that, well, he's clean as a whistle. Go ahead, explain it. Put yourself under oath. That's where he should have been. He may well not be eligible to even run in 2024. Under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, someone, after having sworn an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution, engages in insurrection against the United States is disqualified. And insurrection is defined as attempting to thwart the enforcement of federal law, one of which is the 12th Amendment or the Electoral Count Act. And we have heard chapter and verse over the last weeks, not refuted by anything that Mr. Trump has said, that he was haranguing, doing everything in his power other than taking a gun to Mike Pence's head, saying, do not count those electoral votes, which is the very definition of insurrection. It's very unfortunate that we have Mr. Trump, whose signature as president was his infamous statement on July 23rd, 2019, quote, then I have Article 2, where I have the right to do anything I want as president, a throwback to King George III. Our crisis is not about policies. It's about upholding the Constitution and the rule of law. And that is where CPAC, the Republican Party, and Mr. Trump are an ever-present danger to our continuation as a republic. If those things are not repudiated, we are likely to return to something the equivalent of a monarchy in 2024.
Melik Abdul, what do you make of what Bruce Fein tells us, that Donald Trump could have done himself a world of good, and the Republican Party as well, if he'd avoided making these kinds of fiery speeches that he made at CPAC and instead volunteered to appear before the January 6th committee?
Well, I don't make much of that at all. These things were said about Donald Trump in 2016, and for all intents and purposes, the many people who actually gravitated to Donald Trump, despite whatever psychosis people believe that Donald Trump has, or is narcissism or whatever, whether that was whether that was Bill and Hillary Clinton attending his wedding, or him palling around with rappers, or Oprah Winfrey, or many of these other people. Donald Trump is the same person that he has been. I don't think these sort of ad hominem attacks actually work on Donald Trump. We've seen that as far as the January 6th commission. I actually thought that the commission itself was unnecessary simply because we know from the various reports, the actual bipartisan support, the bipartisan Senate intelligence support, we know from the Department of Homeland Security, we know from our Inspector General reports, many of the things that actually led to and recommendations that they gave so that these things won't happen again. there is a reason why, even under Joe Biden, our federal government has yet to prosecute anyone with a crime called insurrection. So I understand while it's a very sexy phrase for people to use, but our federal government has yet to prosecute or indict one single person for insurrection. But that is the catch-all phrase for what happened, which was very unfortunate, and we should condemn what happened on January 6th.
Okay.
But these sort of attacks on Donald Trump or anything like that, I mean, we've kind of been here before, and not just with Donald Trump. These are the perceptions of any Republican, and I'm one who actually came to the party in 2016, and when I was a Democrat, the things that being said on the panels now, these are the things that were said, not just about people like Donald Trump, but also Michael Steele, who's now on the other side of Donald Trump in the Republican Party.
Okay, Spencer Critchley, I want to move on to the other big political development over the past weekend, and we saw a political victory this weekend with passage, political victory for Joe Biden, that is, with passage of the in the U.S. Senate of the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, there were some serious compromises that had to be made to get on board all the Democratic senators, but how significant is this?
Oh, it's hugely significant, and it's interesting to see how the narrative has completely changed across so much of the media just in the past week, from Democrats in disarray, the classic sort of narrative, to Democrats in array, question mark. And that, too, I think is a sign of really the degradation of our liberal democratic culture, unfortunately, to now inhabiting a world of symbolism and theater, and the infantilization of the general public as we become increasingly emotion-driven. Now, I think we were rationalistic to a fault, and I think this is typically, in fact, a problem that liberals of the left need to face up to. I'd like to also just mention, in response to what Melik just said, I think that he's exactly right about the danger of ad hominem attacks, and there have been far too many of them in the past and even now on both sides. However, I think Trump is a unique case where he is a moral catastrophe, and part of what we need to understand in understanding the true risk to our democracy is that it's a moral failure across the board. But that said, these are big policy wins for Joe Biden, and in fact, it's now being remarked, you know, the underlying substantive truth that he's one of the most accomplished presidents in many decades already, despite this symbol-driven narrative we've been hearing.
Right, Spencer, a big win, but at what cost? Because if we look at the process that this went through, there were two Democrat senators who were holdouts. They wanted something in return for their vote. One of those senators was Kristen Sinema. She was the recipient of vast sums of money from the finance industry, and she managed to gut that bill, taking out higher taxes for certain hedge fund managers. The other was Joe Manchin, who got money from the pipeline industry and made sure that there were provisions in that bill for the pipeline industry. I mean, isn't this corruption, pure and simple?
I don't think we can call it corruption. It is certainly regrettable and all too typical of the role of money in politics. One thing I agree with Joe Manchin about, though, is, and it's one of the few things I agree with him about, is that if Democrats are unhappy with the way he votes or Kristen Sinema votes, they need to win more elections. And I think this is an important part of liberals in general, looking at why it is that despite liberal policies, liberal of the left policies being very popular with Americans, liberals still manage to lose elections that they should win. And really, I think that's the way forward for the Democratic Party, is to win more elections and just get better at politics so the politics is as good as the policy.
Right. Rina, Shah, I was reading some commentary on the passage of that bill, and Mark Goldwyn, who is a senior policy director at the Committee for a Responsible Budget, he talked with Vox News, and this is what he had to say about the bill. He said, for the most part, this isn't a bill about 2022. This is about 2023, 2024, and 2025. What does that mean for an electorate that is seeking help right now?
Well, I think the passage of this hugely transformative bill is, which is expected to pass in the U.S. House even as early as this Friday. Look, the passage of it in the Senate tells you that they know they needed to get something done. These senators know that nothing was coming out of their chamber for a long time that could really serve poor Americans and middle-class Americans, too. This bill also drives down the cost of utilities for everyday Americans like me. That gets me excited. I'm not a Democrat, but I can tell you, when I see my elected officials doing something about healthcare, doing something about inflation, doing something about climate change, which is one of the most existential threats of our time, and I'm a mother, I've got 3 children who are going to be on this earth, hopefully, after I'm long gone. This is an issue here that we know there needed to be action on. And Congress has long been, caught up in gridlock, and people have been discontented with their actions. This was a pivotal moment for not just Joe Biden's presidency, but for the terms of many Democrats sitting in the U.S. Senate. So I applaud them for getting something done. Of course, Republicans are going to go with the playbook, that this was reckless spending, that this is going to drive up inflation. The Congressional Budget Office has said this is not going to drive up the deficit. It's very important for American people. And look, we have a fundamentally unserious electorate out here that doesn't care about what their elected officials are doing. But then around the time of elections, they want to get out there and complain about it. Well, pay attention. Look at what your elected official is doing for you. If they're willing to make an investment in our future, that tells you about the right now. The right now is going to get better because the senators elected to do the right thing on Sunday, just yesterday. And I'm looking forward to see what these investments will do. I'm not a big fan of massive federal spending, but I know they needed to start somewhere. And that should make every American happy, regardless of your partisan stripes.
Bruce Fein, as Rina just told us a moment ago, this will go to the House of Representatives, where it is expected to pass. It will become law very soon. But what are your thoughts on this? Is this irresponsible, reckless spending, or is this something at the right time for the American people?
Well, I think it's neither. It's largely euphemisms and theatrics. Remember, this is a bill that's supposed to have spending over 10 years of like $230 billion. That is a tiny fraction of the size of the U.S. economy. I mean, it's hardly a decimal point. You saw Inflation Reduction Act, right? It reminds me of Gerald Ford's Whip Inflation Now in 1975, which caused him to lose the election. There's nothing in the bill that addresses inflation whatsoever. So it's all cosmetics. And the Democrats are praising it as some kind of landmark bill. It will have virtually no impact, in my judgment, on the economy. And it will not result in, I believe, any great victories for the Democrats because it won't have any real-life impact on the voters. It's another example of beware of members of Congress who promise the world and put flowery language in a statute. Remember, this bill started out as Build Back America. Yeah. That was before inflation was a problem. So when inflation's a problem, they changed the title as though that really is going to change the impact. I would just request one opportunity to say there have been charges for sedition, the equivalent of insurrection, against the January 6 persons, and to insinuate that the charges against Mr. Trump are ad hominem, are Orwellian statements. That's the statement I quoted is ad hominem. This is William Barr, his attorney general, Pat Cipollone, his White House counsel. All of his, Mike Pence is engaging in ad hominem attacks against Mr. Trump. There's his former cybersecurity chief saying the safest election ever. It is exactly that kind of divorce from reality that's a danger to the United States, and not accepting debate on the merits and simply living in a fantasy land that may cause us to collapse.
All right, Rina, go ahead.
If I could, I'm very skeptical of what's patched together in the U.S. Congress, but this bill is not just cosmetic. It is going to cap the price of insulin for many Americans who suffer from diabetes. It's going to lower prescription drug prices. I mean, this is stuff that should just be basic. This meets our basic needs. I come from the state of West Virginia. I was born and raised there and have strong family ties there today. I've known Senator Joe Manchin for almost 2 decades, though I've disagreed with him vehemently. I know he wanted to get this bill through the Inflation Reduction Act. Why? Because at its core, it can create jobs. He knows that, and he has to do that for his constituency in West Virginia, which relies on coal, fossil fuels. This bill helps our country transition away from fossil fuels and towards cleaner and renewable sources. That can mean jobs in new sectors for Americans in states like West Virginia. So it's not a small thing. This is not just window dressing. This has real-world impact, particularly for people in my home state of West Virginia.
Spencer, what did you make of what Bruce Fein said, that this is, I mean, the amount of money that we're talking about here is a fraction of the U.S. budget, that it's cosmetics, it doesn't have any real-life impact on people?
Yeah, Actually, Bruce just said some things that I wanted to say about seditious conspiracy, et cetera. So I strongly endorse what he just said about the utter seriousness of the work of the January 6th committee.
Right.
And I also agree with what Rina just said. I think on the subject of inflation reduction, Bruce has the wrong denominator in his fraction here. If you compare the $300 and some billion, I believe it is, that's planned for this over 10 years and put that over the entire U.S. economy, of course, that looks like a relative drop in the bucket. Even the annual defense budget of the United States is far bigger than this. But when you look at the way it's targeted, as I think Rina just very accurately pointed out, it's going to make an enormous difference in the lives of Americans and in the lives of all of us by targeting those investments, for example, in green technology. Which I think, a conservative might disagree with as having the government get involved in economic planning. I agree with it because I think there are such things as market failures, and we've seen enormous successes from things like the invention of the internet and the interstate highway system, for example, when government does this right. But also some of it is good conservative economics, like negotiating prescription drug prices, which, it's mystical why, and literally mystical why conservatives would be against that and still call themselves conservatives. So I think the actual real impact of this is very, very significant. It's the largest climate legislation, I believe, passed by any government in the world so far.
Right. Melik Abdul, you get the last word on the Inflation Reduction Bill. What did you make of it?
I think it's definitely a political win for Joe Biden. Yes, it's a very scaled down Build Back Better plan that they tried to actually get through last year. The question is whether or not this will actually help the Biden administration in the midterms. Republicans only need, I think, 4, maybe 5 seats to actually take back the House. It's a bit more questionable in the Senate, but I think it's a political win for him. Whether or not it does something typically for the American people, that's left to be seen. It was Bernie Sanders himself who said that as far as inflation, this does nothing to actually tackle inflation itself. And some of the things that are in there, as far as the green technology and the climate change things that are in the bill, there are things in there that some people probably would actually say that are good, but keep in mind there are a number of other things, for instance, like the rebates. Sure, if you're able to afford solar panels, if you're able to afford electric cars, you can get a rebate from that. But I will push back on the notion that somehow ad hominems don't matter. Ad hominems actually do matter, and as someone who's been the recipient of that many times before, the idea that just because you're justified in saying it, then that's the right thing to say. I disagree with that at all. There are many things that are said about Donald Trump, even now on this platform, with fellow panelists that I think don't actually resonate beyond the people who are already.
I don't think that's the point at all. I don't think that's the point at all.
I have to end it there. We have run out of time, but thanks to all of you for being with us. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.